Hello to everybody. You hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, Euthymios Malakes was a prominent scholar of the 20th century and bishop of Nea Patre, Ipati, probably from the middle of the century until his death. As far as it concerned his family, there is a little information available, with it being limited to the fact that his place of origin was Thebes, East Central Greece, and that he had family ties with the Tournikis family. Euthymios, however, even before his promotion to the metropolitan throne, must have had a prominent social position, which is sufficiently confirmed through his writing activity. As for the surviving work, it consists of 3 laudatory speeches addressed to the Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, 3 funerals for Eustathios of Thessaloniki, Alexis Komnenos Kotostephanos, and Nikolaos Agiotheodoritis, respectively 9 introductory prologues, probably were to be completed in the future, 2 epigrams, and a collection of 35 letters to eminent persons of his time. On these 35 letters, 27 which survive in Berlinensis Graecus 76 are unsigned, while the rest 7 are delivered in Petropolitanus Graecus 250 with reference to the author's name. The recipient of Euthymios Malakes, the recipient of Euthymios Malakes include both senior government officials and clergy, who consist also the majority of them. Nevertheless, for only 20 letters are we sure of recipient's identity, while for the remaining 15 we can conclude or even speculate their status in only 6. As part of our presentation, we will focus on the letter corpus of Euthymios Malakes and the evaluation of his epistles as a body for the preservation and expression of the previous classical literary tradition, historical, mythological, in terms of content, motives, and especially mythological forms. The use of language and style skills should make people recognize the trend in eloquent words and expression, with expressive nice formulas or some hyperactivity take place here as well. The author's workshop extends to cuts, to rhetorical figures, to rare words, to benefits, to historical events, to mythological names, to allusions, to fine jokes and forms of speech. It is our intention to examine whether a scholar of the Byzantine region, living far from the spiritual center of the empire, communicates and converses with officials of the secular and ecclesiastical domain. At the same time, the aim will be to establish, albeit indirectly, the education that he had received, which is reflected in his letters, not always of literary content, and to what extent this was harmonized with the context of the Byzantine correspondence tradition. A first theoretical approach to the use of mythological quotations with exemplary function is made in Aristotle's rhetoric. Aristotle generally includes the examples in the artistic beliefs, and in particular the mythological ones in those created by the orator. As a virtue of the example, it identifies the semantic relevance between the myth and the verse in which it is located. The example did not develop as an autonomous literary genre in Byzantine literature, but as an auxiliary element of rhetoric. Its function can be summarized as follows: argument, proof, prompt for imitation, and expressive way. Its use by Malakes is mainly aimed at an aesthetic result, and its function is limited to parable or similitude and imagery. However, it is worth mentioning the accuracy of the choice of each quotation and the parallelism of the mythological person, situation, creature, or object with what is mentioned in the epistolary text. As an element of rhetoric, the example brings the text to life, illustrates the author's ideas, and almost visualizes them. A necessary condition, of course, is the knowledge of ancient Greek mythology. Otherwise, the receiver is unable to conceive and evaluate its selection and relevance. The rhetorical function of the example is often expressed in the form of simile, comparison, contrast, or even metonymy. A common point of comparison is the character, but also the external appearance of the faces. When it comes to a situation, the analogy prevails. Of course, the accuracy of the choice of the example is what ultimately judges the semantic and aesthetic result, and is left solely to the education, knowledge, and rhetorical skill of the author. In epistle number 33, Euthymios begins the text by expressing his grief over the absence from Constantinople of two important people for him, the Metropolitan of Thessaloniki Eusthathios and the Metropolitan of Athens Michael. Both scholars with their personal work seem to have acted beneficially upon their friend's mentality. In the continuation of the letter, Euthymios indulged in extensive praise of his friend, Michael Honiatis, reaching the point of claiming that the nymph Kalliroi justifiably keeps him in Athens. Respectively, in epistle number 1, in the context of the praise of Michael Honiatis, Malakes compares him with the mythical king of Aegina Aeakos, of whom he is clearly superior, as he is also superior to Alcmaeon. Malakes' intention was to praise his friend and correspondent Michael, urging that the latter having taken over the position of the ancient protectors of Athens. He could, for example, like the king of Aegina, Aeakos, summon clouds and create rain to deal with water scarcity, which is an exaggeration. In the limits of the present letter, the author also uses the mythical form of the god Proteus to characterize the bishop of Evripus Valsamon, between whom there were important differences. He describes him therefore as superior to Chameleon and the mythical Proteus, as a lover of pleasure according to the model of Epicure philosophy, and as a clergyman within an appropriate form of life. The analogy of a person with Proteus will be used again in epistle number 26 in order to characterize the recipient. In both cases, the image of Proteus follows the Homeric tradition, according to which it is a sea deity that is constantly chasing forms. On the other hand, Midas, a less known figure, answered a total twice in epistles number 7 and 23. The subject of letter number 7 is the well-known motive of the correspondent silence, while from its title, Etero, it appears that the recipient is a friendly person of Euthymios. He then alludes to the refusal of any assistance to the recipient because at the beginning of their acquaintance, he had deceived him. He presented himself as another Midas, capable of turning everything into gold, while he even tried to convince Euthymios that the stones or the clay were also gold. To him, people who pursue their own self-interest are irresponsible. The aim of the writer is to prove on the one hand that his real friends remember him by keeping in touch with him, and on the other to express his opposition to those who are indifferent and mistakenly consider their attitude to be normal. Euthymios lies to his correspondent about arrogance and indifference towards his friends, while he considered his attitude as a result of his sudden wealth. For instance, he states that he will continue to walk on foot as a sign of his poverty, while on the contrary, his friend, being rich, will walk on horseback and the locals will mock him. In both cases, Midas is presented as a symbol of wealth, but with a negative meaning, since it is used by the author in order to criticize the recipients. The first because he tried to deceive him, while the second because he had adopted a liberated lifestyle. At the same time, Homeric forms are directly or indirectly present in the correspondent collections. In epistle number 12, Malakes, wanting to describe his recipient, bishop of old Patra, Constantino, the soaked health of a despot unknown to us refers to the deformed Homeric hero Thersites, while the postament of the trial, which was supervised by the sick despot, characterized it as thermerio evil. This is an analogy that he will use one more time in order to attribute the reaction of some to the reheating of his relationship, while the unknown recipient of epistle number 16. Only here the size of the hostility will be much larger in proportion to the presence of two other mythical figures, Panic and Caledonian Boar. The references to Homeric figures are completed with epistle number 17, which is Malakes' response to a letter from a friendly person. He himself, therefore, claims the words of his correspondent woke him up from the deep boredom, attracting him more than the legendary lotus Odysseus. In order to find out the poor writing performance and semi-learning of the recipient of epistle 15, he refers to the mythical Corinthian potter Pericles, urging that it is not possible to study a text or even to write a man who knows nothing more than the bottles of this particular potter. In fact, the author, wanting to emphasize even more the spiritual poverty of his correspondent, he likens him to a fan of the Code Mysteries. At this point, we have to mention that Malakes, when he criticized the recipient, is not satisfied only with the use of motifs and shapes of the classical tradition, since next to them, figures of the Christian literature and specifically of Old and New Testament. This is the letter number 6, where Euthymios defined precisely the meaning of the evil nature of the recipient by referring Judas, who, although he belonged to the disciples of Christ, succumbed to avarice and eventually led to suicide. So Euthymios points out to his correspondent that although he managed, even by fraudulent means, to secure a place among prominent men, it does not mean that he is as worthy as them. In support of this position, he uses the parable of the parasites that grow among the wheat and the vines, as well as the example of Saul, who may be among the prophets as well as Judas among the apostles, but they do not enjoy the corresponding honor. The parasites because they are finally removed from the crops, while Saul and Judas because they had an inglorious end. Even if it's only one example, it is indicative that many Byzantine texts of different genres and periods adjust both pagan and Christian examples. The evolution is that Byzantine literature was governed by internal factors and processes with the new foreign influences. The most significant foreign eruption experienced by the Greek literary tradition was the growth within it of Christianity, which exposed biblical textual tradition. The myth of Daedalus and Icarus, beloved in Byzantine literature, is also found in Malakes Epistolarum, but with a different approach. According to Hunger, this mythical couple was used by the Byzantines to express their nostalgia for the correspondent and their desire to meet him flying. In the case of Malakes, however, things are different, since Icarus is projected as an example to be avoided, particularly in epistle number 23, which is addressed to Gregorius Antiochus. Euthymios, after looking for him for arrogance and indifference towards his friends, urges him to be humble and advises him to fly low and close to the shore to avoid falling into the sea and getting lost like Icarus. Respectively, in epistle number 24, Malakes cannot accept the admiration of the common people towards Gregorius Antiochus, while he himself accuses him of excessive wealth and irregular professional development. In fact, he states that Antiochus' claims similar to those of prominent politicians such as Pyrrhus, Divius, Megacles, and Megavisus. The specific comparison of Malakes' correspondent with ancient deities or mythical figures are not the only ones, as the number testify this is a very popular figure of the author. In fact, either when that he desires the praise of the recipient of his accusation, he refers to forms not only of mythology, but also of ancient literature. Indicatively, in the epilogue of epistle number 3, wishing the recipient physical and mental health, Malakes states that the former knows and loves like Criton, Socrates' friend. Alongside, in epistle 8, the author urges the recipient to imitate the cicada from the myth of Euthymios and act immediately to help him with the health problems he faces. The theme of change and transition from good to evil, which is quite popular in Byzantine epistolography, is found here too, but the difference is that luck is not attributed in the form of the ancient Greek goddess. In addition, the alternation of human destiny are given an eschatological connotation, since the author often expresses the belief that through the difficulties of earthly life, posthumous salvation is ensured. Moreover, the idea of Christ or God the Savior is also answered several times. Finally, there are cases where when the later writer wants to refer either in general to extremely difficult situations or to difficulties encountered by himself or his correspondent, he refers to the example of the fearful deeds. Specifically, these are letters number 9 and 3. In the first, Malakes lies to the recipient, the chief tax collector Vardas, for the economic misery to which a large part of the local population had been led due to the heavy taxation, but also for the forced recruitment of inexperienced military farmers of his metropolis. On the contrary, in the second, the deeds of Eurystheus are presented as a painful but achievable goal for those who selflessly toil. Last but not least, we have a mention here that is one more epistle, number 10. The correspondent uses a synonymous phrase, Iraklis os alginon, wanting to describe the bad condition he was experiencing at that time as a result of the misfortune that befell him. It was about health issues that afflicted him and in general the difficulties he was facing too. Concluding our presentation today, it becomes clear that although this is a relatively small collection of letters, the mythological topi are worthily represented by Malakes, and in fact with rare examples that are not part of the basic motives of the rule, which proves its special style and author's deep knowledge of classical literature. According to the available material, his placement in a provincial metropolis far enough from Constantinople is not interpreted by him as a heavy blow to fate, nor as punishment and exile from the empire's cultural center. On the contrary, in spite of the difficulties, personal and not, which he faced, he maintained a high style in his letters, regardless of the position and the spiritual level of his correspondent, which, by the way, was high enough. In fact, the deep knowledge of the classical literary tradition coexists harmoniously in the letters with his Christian education, something that is quantitatively better reflected through the study of the sources of his correspondence. In any case, all the facts quoted above support the fact that Euthymios Malakes was a significant scholar of the Byzantine province, who was in frequent contact with other scholars equal or even superior to him. Thank you very much for your attention.